Today on Voices of Reason, we're joined by Hedtler-Gaudette. Dylan is an expert on judicial and congressional ethics, congressional reform, foreign influence, DOJ independence, and emergency powers, and he has written extensively on these and other subjects. He's been cited in various news outlets, including the Washington Free Beacon, Roll Call, the Washington Examiner, WGBH, the Washington Post, PBS NewsHour, Government Executive, and the Federal News Network. Dylan, thank you so much for joining us today on Voices of Reason.
Thank you so much. Glad to be with you.
One of the big things we wanted to talk to you about was certainly, as you work with the Project on Government Oversight, congressional stock trading. Why has it become such a hot button issue all of a sudden?
It's a great question. And I think the reason congressional stock trading has really captured the public imagination is because it is just so obviously and evidently wrong. It's wrong to the extent that it creates a real sort of ethical and moral stain on the entire institution of Congress. And it really resonates with the people because it's, easy to understand why insider trading is bad and why it's particularly galling that our members of Congress, the people who are supposed to be representing our interests, could potentially be engaging in insider trading and really caring about their own interests first and foremost.
Now, what do members of Congress have to report on their trading activity?
The current law requires a member of Congress to file an annual financial disclosure, which lists out sort of all of their assets and their various financial entanglements. But they also have to file what are called periodic transaction reports, which are more real time or close to real time reporting on when they make individual transactions, such as stock trades. But have they have a month to 45 days to submit those periodic transaction reports, or they're not actually all that real time.
Right. So, if my understanding is correct, since, I guess maybe 30% of Americans actually trade securities, hold securities, there's two different types of accounts, the brokerage account versus the advisory account. Is that right? Is that right? What's the difference between the two?
Uh, But one of them is actively managed typically, and the other one is not. So sometimes you may have a stockbroker, an individual who is um, engaging in transactions on your behalf. You may have a financial advisor who's doing something similar across a broader range of assets aside from just stocks. And slight amendment to your statistic earlier that you cited. It's actually only about 20% of Americans who are directly invested in stocks, and a lot more Americans are actually indirectly invested, typically through things like 401ks or exchange traded funds or mutual funds. So it's actually a pretty small percentage of people who engage in the kind of direct buying, trading, and selling of individual stocks, and it tends to be the much higher income, higher net worth type of people who are actually doing that.
So it's the type of thing where if I wanted to invest in Apple or Nvidia, if I had a brokerage account, I would just call up my broker and say, make the trade. But if I had a managed account, that trade could be executed without my knowledge.
Uh, in theory, yeah. So if you have someone who does that on your behalf, they may not necessarily always be communicating with you about every individual transaction, but it's still I think ultimately your responsibility as the person in whose name those trades are being made, like, and who's making the money or using the money. It's ultimately your responsibility as the person whose name is on that account.
So I did a little research and I saw there's at least 58 pieces of legislation in the U.S. House of Representatives right now that have some type of dealing with congressional stock trading. But the biggest ones right now seem to be the Honest Act, and the most recent one is the Restore Trust in Congress Act. Could you talk to us a little bit about the Honest Act first?
Sure. So the Honest Act is a piece of bipartisan legislation actually that came out of the United States Senate, and it recently was considered and voted on and reported out of the Committee of Jurisdiction in the Senate, which is the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, and that was pretty historic to see that happen in that particular committee because it's an important point along the kind of chain of events that is required to get a piece of legislation passed and into law. So that was a really big deal. That happened earlier this year, about a month and a half ago, and it was co-led by Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri and a couple of other people on the committee, including Senator Gary Peters from Michigan. Um, and so that's a really strong piece of legislation. One interesting thing about the Honest Act is that in addition to prohibiting uh, Congress and the close family members of people in Congress from trading stocks, it also includes the president and the vice president in that prohibition. So it's broader in scope, as opposed to a lot of the other bills, which tend to narrowly focus on just Congress, including the Restore Trust in Congress Act.
What was the point of including the president and the vice president? Was it more of a just if we're going to throw House and Senate members, let's get everyone on board, or was there some targeted reason why the chief executive and second in command would be next?
I think it's about, and I think there's some credibility to this argument, or, it's about having some parity across the three branches of government, or at least two of them in this case, to say that, hey, what's good for the goose is good for the gander here. If we are going to have to operate under a restriction on trading stocks because of the power and the privilege that we have as members of Congress, that is equally true and equally applicable to the president and the vice president. And I think you could argue even more true for the president and vice president in terms of the kind of the power they have to potentially impact the market and impact individual companies. So I think that's the logic there. Tactically is another matter, but if you want to get into that at some later point, we can. But I think conceptually and from the substantive standpoint, I think there is an argument to be made that these kinds of ethics rules, they ought to apply to all higher-ranking government officials, regardless of which branch of government they serve in.
Now we have a representative in Pennsylvania, in the Northeast Pennsylvania region, Rob Bresnahan in the 8th Congressional District, who has been one of the more prolific stock traders since he took office in January, making over 600 transactions through his managed account. He said that he was having difficulty moving all of his holdings into a blind trust. He said basically that the ethics process is prehistoric. I'm quoting it. The ethics process is prehistoric. It's downright excruciating, and it's been a long process that really leaves people that existed in the real world and came from different careers in a bind when you want to provide a life of public service. Why would Bresnahan take that stance where perhaps others who have been in the same situation really haven't come out and made that kind of statement?
Honestly, I think it's I'll put it mildly. I don't find that to be a persuasive argument, because a lot of other people have chosen to run for Congress. Again, I just want to be clear, they chose to run for Congress. You don't get drafted to do this. It's not compulsory to run for Congress and to be a member of Congress. In fact, it's a sacred privilege to do so, to represent constituents in our legislative body. And so with that comes an amount of sacrifice and responsibility. And there is an understanding and an agreement, kind of a compact, if you will, between the people who are being represented and those who are doing the representing. So our constituents, constituents and those who represent constituents, there's an agreement between them. And that's like, you're going to have to do some things that you wouldn't have to do if you remained a private citizen, including you have to file financial disclosures. You have to, like a lot of your life becomes public domain,
Right,
if you
right.
will. I think another aspect of that is you have to avoid even the appearance of impropriety and the appearance of corruption by doing things like, divesting yourself of financial assets that create that appearance of impropriety or the real thing, And so there have been other members of Congress who have managed to transfer their assets into blind trust. There have been still more who have chosen to go even further than that and just straight up trade off of anything that they had previously. So they may have owned individual stocks, but they decided to sell all of them off once they became members of Congress in order to, again, try to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. So Mr. Bresnahan could have easily done that if he so chose. He could set up a blind trust if he so chose. I think he's just using procedural arguments to kind of, I think, avoid doing something he doesn't want to do in the first place. And, I'm playing the world's tiniest violin over here for him.
So I want to make sure that people listening completely understand the legislation that's currently running through House committees doesn't say you cannot own stocks, but they're saying you can't actively trade while you're a member. You can move everything into a blind trust. Could you explain perhaps what exactly a blind trust means for these folks?
Sure. Yeah, yeah. And bring a little bit of helpful context, as there are some bills that don't even allow you to have a blind trust. Now,
Okay.
some other bills do certainly allow you to have a blind trust as well, but so blind trusts are basically they are trusts. They're kind of like vehicles, containers, if you will, that you're able to put assets into, and they are managed by an independent trustee who you are legally prohibited from having contact with. Uh, but that's how they are, unique compared to things like the kinds of trust, the funds you were talking about earlier, brokerage accounts and managed accounts and things like that, because you can't have any contact with the person who's supposed to be managing those assets and making any decisions around them. So it is a way to sort of insulate against that least insider trading. The problem with blind trust, and this is always always a sticking point when it comes to negotiating these kind of legislative compromises, is that blind trust really only, I think they only address one half of the like two-sided coin of this problem, and that's like they take care of insider trading, but they don't take care of conflicts of interest. Because if you know you own a bunch of Apple, to use your example from earlier, right? And you transfer all of your Apple stock into a blind trust, you are still very well aware that you are financially tethered to the fortunes of Apple. And so, as a member of Congress, you could still be doing things trying to privilege and trying to help Apple as a company or its industry as a whole in order to prop up a the company, B, the industry, but C, your own financial portfolios. So blind trusts are imperfect. They are kind of intermediate half measures, but they would still be a hell of an improvement over the status quo.
You make a good point there. It's a case where representatives are privileged with the type of inside information they receive. And the fact that maybe only 20% of individuals in America own stocks, we don't aren't privileged that kind of information beyond maybe a quarterly call with the analysts and that kind of thing. So this type of information can be used and perhaps has been used, and just the general public is not aware. Or is this bubbling to the surface now that the public's beginning to see examples of, for lack of a better phrase, inside trading?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a bit of a tricky challenge to talk about insider trading, because insider trading is one of those crimes that's like hard to prove unless the person who's engaging in the conduct is extraordinarily sloppy or extraordinarily stupid. You have to have the real smoking gun that creates this causal link between information A over here, insider information that someone obtained over here, and then a specific financial transaction B that they made over here, right? And oftentimes it's very hard to do that because most people doing this kind of uh, corruption behind the scenes here are not that stupid. So there's a little bit of a distance created between those two things. But what we do see quite often are things that look suspicious because of the timing. So a member of Congress will engage in a large amount of transactions like right before a big vote is going to be taken, or in the aftermath of the introduction of a bill being announced, or some kind of announcement. You saw a lot of trading, for example, around the tariff announcements made earlier this year by the president, and some members of Congress appeared to benefit in a large way around that kind of announcement and trying to game the system in that way. So it often just looks really suspicious and looks really bad, though we don't have as many examples of actual insider trading that has been proven to the point of an actual legal indictment and conviction.
So last week, a bipartisan group of House members, including Pennsylvanians Brian Fitzpatrick and Scott Perry, uh, brought forth the Restore Trust in Congress Act. Basically, if I understand correctly, Dylan, it was basically taking a lot of the bills that are currently in the House system and trying to merge them into one, and putting that forward as the one that both Republicans and Democrats can get behind. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And it's really it's worth noting how important that is, because part of what has prevented a stock trading ban from being enacted up to this point is that there have always been these competing bills, that have been offered by a number of different people, Republicans and Democrats. And it's been very hard to get enough of a kind of like critical mass of members of Congress to coalesce around one bill, which made it harder to actually kind of like have a bill pass through all the steps it has to go through in Congress in order for it to move and become law. So the fact that the House was able to do this in a bipartisan way, and they were able to bring together a bunch of the most prominent sort of uh, um, congressional champions of the issue, like all have them in a room and all have them behind the same bill is really important. And you mentioned Congressman Fitzpatrick. He in particular has long been a champion of this issue, and he had his own bipartisan bill
Right.
with Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez that he was leading for a while, and so he was a very active part of this negotiation process, and he deserves a lot of credit for his longtime principled kind of leadership on this issue.
It's worth noting from a Pennsylvania standpoint that two other representatives have signed on, including Rob Bresnahan out of the Northeast Pennsylvania, and Democrat Mary Gay Scanlon out of the 5th Congressional District has also signed on as a co-sponsor of the bill. Dylan, I think there might be some folks out there that might be cynical of this whole situation, kind of in the way that we talk about term limits, that why would members of Congress ever vote for something that would be against their best interest, I guess is the easiest way to put it. Am I being too cynical, or are other people being too cynical about this?
I don't. I would not say you're being too cynical, or anyone would be too cynical. I think it's very understandable why, if one were to look at how Congress typically acts in this way or doesn't act, it's completely understandable that we would have a sort of a jaundiced view of Congress in terms of its conduct and its ethical behavior. So I don't blame anyone for feeling that way. The one interesting wrinkle when it comes to congressional stock trading is it's an idiosyncratic issue insofar as it really brings together a strange collection of people in Congress and outside of Congress, actually outside of Congress in the broader public. It's an issue that enjoys wide bipartisan kind of support, at the high levels. It's not just a majority thing where it's like extraordinarily high levels of support among Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And I think that's sort of reflected in the amount of bipartisan support it has in Congress. So it doesn't cut along the traditional party lines where it's Republicans in favor and opposed by Democrats or vice versa. It does bring together that strange collection of partners and champions together, and so that's why I think there is some hope. Because it is a strange issue in that way, but it's strange in that way because it's so obvious and it's such a common sense practical thing. And it's worth mentioning that part of why it has some momentum now is because President Trump has come out in favor of it. And so I think that kind of creates a permission structure for a lot of other people in Congress to also be in favor of it.
That's a great point. You recently penned an article where you said there are numerous ways Congress could get a stock ban done and do so quickly if they choose to act. It seems like they're choosing to act. How quickly do you think something like this could actually appear on the president's desk?
Yeah, so if congressional leadership wanted to, and so when I say leadership, I mean the Speaker of the House, the minority leader in the House, the majority leader in the Senate, and the minority leader in the Senate. If they wanted to, they could get this done quickly, within a week or two, if they so chose. Because especially in the House, the Speaker basically has all the power to decide like what comes up and what does not come up in terms of a vote on the floor. Like he basically has all the authority to decide those things. And the same thing pretty much over in the Senate. If the majority leader decides he wants to bring something to the floor, there are parliamentary procedures that are available to him to do so pretty quickly. They haven't done that up to this point because I don't feel they haven't felt the pressure to do so. But that pressure has been building, and it's been building over years. But it does appear to be hitting sort of a critical mass at this point, as you've noted earlier. And so I'm cautiously optimistic we could actually have this on the president's desk before the end of the 119th Congress. And so, you're probably aware of this, and your readers are too. But a Congress runs for 2 years, so this is the first year of the 119th Congress, and next year is the second year. So I'm cautiously optimistic that by the end of next year we will have a stock trading ban that will have been signed into law by the president.
I think that's one of the great things for the commoners who may be tuning in, saying end of next year is quickly getting work done, but maybe that's just the way that Congress works. You also do additional work with other congressional reform. What kind of things that we should be looking out for right now in terms of other reforms that could take place in Washington, the way it works?
So we're big proponents of trying to rebalance what we view as an imbalanced kind of power distribution in Washington, and in particular, we think that Congress, has always was always intended to be the most powerful branch. It's the first branch. It's the Article 1 branch. It had the most specific and explicit powers enumerated to it in the Constitution. But in recent decades, that balance of power has grown out of whack. So we have basically an executive branch that is extraordinarily powerful, a Congress that is extraordinarily weak, and then a court system that has the ultimate, like the final word on a lot of things. And like that is not how the system was intended to work. So we're all about trying to advance reforms to make Congress the sort of primary actor that it's supposed to be. So trying to reinvigorate Congress's power of the purse, for example, the control and the decision-making power it's supposed to have over spending. Trying to reform and strengthen Congress's war power. Congress is supposed to be the entity that actually declares war and decides if we do that. But in recent decades, they've abrogated almost all of that authority to the executive branch, and I think that carries huge accountability and transparency problems with it. So that's the kind of reform we care a lot about, like trying to rebalance things to make sure that Congress, the most responsive institution in our system of government, is empowered and has the resources and the capacity and the will to do what it needs to do in order to represent the American people most effectively.
Dylan, very appreciative of your time. We'll get you out of here on this one. Gerrymandering has become a hot button issue as well. As you see, Texas making their move to redraw their congressional districts, California countering, others are talking about it. Is this part of congressional reform that we should be actively pursuing as well?
Yeah, so I just want to caveat by saying that POGO, the organization I work for, doesn't actively advocate in the space of you're talking about gerrymandering or redistricting policy, things like that. But I would say, like a lot of other areas of the government, I think we're seeing a kind of an institutional decay here where it's a race to the bottom. Everyone is just trying to use the tool closest to hand to gain partisan advantage here, and it's not a one side or the other thing. There are blue states that are heavily gerrymandered, and there are red states that are heavily gerrymandered. And I think the principle of politicians choosing who their voters are, as opposed to voters choosing who their politicians are, I think that's a perversion of the system, and I don't think it's a good thing.
Our thanks to Dylan Hedtler-Gaudette, the Acting VP for Policy and Government Affairs with the project of Government Oversight and a proud graduate of the University of Southern Maine. Dylan, thank you so much for spending time with us today on Voices of Reason.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
My thanks to Dylan Hedtler-Gaudette, Acting Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs with the project of Government Oversight, for joining us today on Voices of Reason. My name is Steve Ulrich. Thanks for spending part of your day with us. See you next time.